Hello and welcome all grade 12s to the History Crew channel. In this video, we will be exploring the main issues regarding the civil rights movement in the 1960s. After the Second World War, many people living in Western countries felt that there was no true democracy and equality in their own societies. In the 1960s, there was an increase in mass protests by common people around the world. Many African Americans who lived in the southern states of the USA experienced extreme racism, and segregation laws prevented them from voting. These laws were commonly referred to as the Jim Crow laws. They were also subjected to extreme racism from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who believed in white superiority over all other races. After the American Civil War, new laws were passed which gave African Americans political rights, including the right to vote. These were gradually taken away when conservative whites regained political control in the southern states of the USA and passed new laws which took away those rights or created obstacles which prevented African Americans from fully exercising their constitutional rights. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was formed in 1909 to fight against segregation and discrimination. Over the years, they campaigned against inequality in issues such as the right to vote and access to housing. The Congress of Racial Equality was formed in 1942, and over time the membership of both organizations grew steadily. These two organizations were at the forefront in the campaign for civil rights. An important achievement in the campaign for civil rights came in the 1950s, when the Naacp challenged segregation in the public education system in a case called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. A group of African American children were refused entry into a school, and the case was taken to the Supreme Court. This was due to the elementary schools in Topeka being racially segregated, with separate facilities for black and white children. The High Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional and all schools must be desegregated. The next important step in the development of the civil rights movement was a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1956. Rosa Parks, an African American, was arrested for violating the bus's segregation policy. Her arrest sparked a massive bus boycott, which lasted almost a year. The boycott crippled the bus companies financially, and the Supreme Court eventually ruled that segregation on buses were illegal. During this boycott, a young minister, by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., rose in prominence. He became as a prominent, respected leader among African Americans, and even though his house was fire-bombed and he was harassed by the police, he continued to work to keep the boycott going. In 1957, King and a network of black ministers formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference (SCLC). It trained civil rights activists how to organize nonviolent protests, and how to deal with the police, the law and the media. King's philosophy was one of nonviolent resistance, or civil disobedience. He believed that civil rights protesters who were attacked or jailed could reform their oppressors with peace, love and forgiveness. He also firmly believed that blacks and whites could live together in equality and friendship. In the 1960s, black and white students who were inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. sprang into action and formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Their main aim was to plan and conduct a series of peaceful civil disobedience campaigns. The first form of nonviolent civil obedience was organized by the student members to expose segregation. These students organized a sit-in protest at a Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, where black customers were not allowed to use restaurant facilities. However, they were verbally and in some cases physically abused, but this action gained massive media exposure and inspired others to join in the civil rights protests. Soon there were other sit-ins taking place in the city, and it spread to other parts of the state and the country. Black and white students also organized a strategy to expose segregation on interstate buses. Inspired by the Montgomery bus boycotts, the Freedom Riders initiative was conducted. The Freedom Riders traveled on buses heading from state to state, in order to expose the segregation on buses. They were met with violence, however this was a success too because they created awareness and forced an intervention from the president, who sent troops to protect the Freedom Riders as well. Interstate buses were forced to desegregate. In the Freedom Summer of 1964, black and white volunteers opened freedom schools in order to improve literacy among the African Americans because in order to vote at the time, candidates had to take a test to qualify to vote. As a result, they registered thousands of new black voters. This was a huge success for the CRM even though there was a violent reaction for their efforts. Black churches were bombed, hundreds of Freedom Summer workers were beaten and arrested, and 6 were murdered. Civil rights campaigners also held protest marches to get support and publicity for their cause. Those who participated in the marches often had to face police aggression and violence as well as possible arrest. In 1963, Martin Luther King shifted his focus to Birmingham, known for its racism and prejudice, and organized a protest march in the town. On the 2nd of May, 1,000 children gathered in churches and began the Children's Crusade, heading throughout the city to protest segregation peacefully. On the first day of the protest, hundreds of children were arrested. On the second day, Commissioner of Public Safety Bull Connor ordered police to spray the children with powerful water hoses, hit them with batons and threaten them with police dogs. The images were broadcasted internationally, creating massive public outcry and support for the movement. It also forced the government to act. President Kennedy intervened and ordered the governor of Alabama to release the protesters and end segregation in the state. The March on Washington was another massive protest march that occurred in August 1963, when 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. People of all races attended this well-organized event, which was the largest political gathering in U.S. history, joined together to demand full racial equality. Martin Luther King also delivered his infamous "I Have a Dream" speech. As a result, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which barred segregation and discrimination in employment and public facilities. This was a massive victory for the movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was present for the signing. This was a momentous victory for the civil rights campaign. In 1964, some Freedom School volunteers were captured and killed by white supremacists. In response to this, civil rights campaigners led by King organized a march from Selma to Montgomery, a distance of 81 kilometers. Selma was notorious for the attitude of its racist and brutal sheriff, Jim Clark. Only 2.4% of African Americans in Selma had registered to vote because of the intimidation by white authorities. This march was banned by the authorities, but it still went ahead. During the first march, 600 marchers were threatened by hostile crowds and viciously attacked by police using batons and tear gas, who prevented the peaceful marchers from crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This became known as Bloody Sunday. The violent response gained massive exposure and support for the movement. Thousands of Americans of all races and religion heeded Martin Luther King Jr.'s call and arrived in Selma to join the march in solidarity. During the second march, King decided to turn back at the last minute, concerned about another possible attack by the police. But the third march was much bigger and the marchers were now protected by state troopers sent by President Johnson, and they were able to successfully reach Montgomery. In response to the Selma-Montgomery March, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, which outlawed obstacles to voting. After this, thousands of African Americans in Selma began to register as voters, and in the next election Jim Clark was voted out of office. This was yet another momentous victory for the movement. The civil rights movement achieved major victories in the fight against discrimination and inequality. The CRM was successful in legally ending discrimination in the USA through various forms of protest. All Americans were now equal before the law. Thank you for watching, and please remember to subscribe to the History Crew channel.